warming is something that everyone has had to deal with. Somewhere there's been conversations or you've learned about it in school. As our planet gets warmer and the ice starts to melt, people have become increasingly worried about what is going to happen to our country and what is going to happen to the world, because this is something that not only affects people in the United States, but it affects people all across the world. And to reduce this global warming, it is something that all countries have to do together, and they have to come together as one to do so. But it's not always that easy, and there have been many alternatives to getting rid of these carbon emissions that are leading to the global warming, but it has been very hard for all countries to come to a consensus and actually implement something. Which leads me to my question today of should more governments embrace nuclear power to reduce carbon emissions? To properly answer this question, I'll be splitting my speech up into 3 main points. My first main point is going to be talking about what these carbon emissions are and how nuclear power plays into that. My second point will be talking about what would happen if governments did implement this nuclear power. And my third and final main point will be answering the question. Moving on to my first main point of what are these carbon emissions and what does nuclear power have to do with it? The carbon emissions are what is leading to global warming, and it is something that we have seen all across the world, because as the carbon emissions go up, so does global warming and the warming of our planet. And according to EPA.gov, these carbon emissions come from the burning of fossil fuels for things like electricity and transportation. We are constantly using things like fossil fuels, especially for our homes and heating up our homes, that is going to increase these carbon emissions. And as an entire globe, we have become increasingly dependent on these fossil fuels that lead to these carbon emissions, and it's something that has not been helpful. It is something that's not been helpful because then the planet starts to warm up. But there aren't many alternatives. Now, some people have suggested that we use things like nuclear power. And according to the worldnuclear.org, that these nuclear power plants don't increase any carbon emissions and they don't use any carbon emissions in production and during its lifespan. So some people have looked to this idea of, carbon emissions would be great. If we use nuclear power to reduce these carbon emissions, that would be great. However, there are logistical problems with using nuclear power, such as what do you do with the nuclear waste? The nuclear waste is a big problem that happens with using nuclear power because now it is waste that only breaks down, that has a half-life of some extreme number. And it is something that is not logistical for a lot of people to use because then they have the problem of, okay, so where does this nuclear waste go? And that's something that even Nevada has seen with Yucca Mountain and wanting to put the nuclear waste there. So nuclear power, although there are benefits, there are some very logistical consequences, especially of the nuclear waste and where that goes. And that would just create another problem on top of the global warming problem that we're already having. This leads me to my second main point of what would happen if governments actually did embrace nuclear power to reduce the carbon emissions. Now, this is something that we haven't seen in a lot of countries because there has been a lot of pushback against this nuclear power and this nuclear waste in terms of popularity. But according to Al Jazeera on June 7th, 2019, there are currently 9 nuclear power plants in Japan right now. So Japan has a high carbon emissions, and they decided that they were going to focus more upon, okay, so what do we do? How do we reduce this? And they decided to look towards nuclear power. But nuclear power isn't something that has been looked upon or seen as a good thing in Japan throughout the public, and their carbon emissions are still up. They haven't been able to properly rely and depend on this nuclear power enough, and it isn't something that is popular throughout the other people. And governments embracing this, meaning that there would have to be more nuclear power plants throughout countries, and that would be something extremely hard to do, especially in super populated places, because you have to find those little areas where the nuclear power plant would go, and it could ruin neighborhoods all throughout the globe. And it is something that the government would genuinely have to really work on to ensure that it was actually placed in properly. And that's something that would take years and years of work when these global warming and these carbon emissions are something that needs to be dealt with now. And it needs to be dealt with things like renewable resources, as we've already seen, and not these nuclear power that it brings more problems than you actually get. Which leads me to my third and final main point of no, governments shouldn't embrace nuclear power to reduce carbon emissions. As we've seen throughout this speech, the logistical idea of actually embracing these carbon emissions are something that it's not logistical, and it is something that comes with extreme consequences. For example, this nuclear waste. What happens to it? We're already having a problem worldwide with our trash. We have trash and it's like going in dumps, but then what happens? It just keeps going, and we keep adding to it and adding to it, and it's already a problem that we're starting to see. And then if we burn it, then we're adding more, harming the problem of global warming in all throughout the globe. So it's a problem that we're already seeing with trash. But now, if we have nuclear waste, which has to be disposed of properly and has to be disposed of in certain ways, otherwise everything doesn't work. And if it's not disposed of properly, it's not healthy, or it's not good for anyone, and it can genuinely kill people and really harm them. It is a bigger problem, and it is something that is not going to fix the problem of carbon emissions that we're seeing right now. And according to the Manhattan Institute, .org on August 17th, 2019, some environmentalists are strongly opposed to using nuclear power to reduce these carbon emissions, and they say that the only way that we need to use the energy is we need to use renewable resources. Now, these environmentalists are saying these renewable resources because it is something that can be renewed, and it's not something that is adding to the bigger problem. Not to mention, in 2011, there was a tsunami in Japan, and because of this tsunami, it knocked out nuclear power plants in Japan, and it led to a nuclear accident. And this was something that hurt many, many people, and many people were harmed because of it. And because of this, the nuclear power plants don't have a logistical thing, and they can be knocked out, where if these renewable resources are hurt by other things, it's not going to harm anyone. But these nuclear power plants, if anything happens, or if their waste is disposed of improperly, it's going to harm a lot of people. So as we can see, these carbon emissions are something that the world is struggling with. But nuclear power is not the solution. Thank you.